The pain woke me at 7:13. Not gradually all at once, the kind that settles in your chest like a fist tightening from the inside. I made it halfway to the kitchen before my knees stopped negotiating with me. The floor came up hard and cold beneath my palms. For a minute, maybe two, I stayed there trying to convince myself it would pass. I am not a woman who startles easily. I have managed payroll crises, client portfolios, and a household simultaneously, without losing my footing. I have handled emergencies while other people were still trying to figure out where the problem started. But lying on that kitchen floor with my heartbeat thudding unevenly against my ribs, I understood something clearly for the first time in years. My body was not asking for permission anymore. My name is Samira Hollis. I have been married for 19 years. I have built more than most people will ever know, and most of it quietly. That night, I learned exactly how dangerous quiet can become when the wrong people get comfortable inside it. I called Dave first. He answered on the third ring. His voice hit me before his words did, relaxed, smooth, not distracted or strained, comfortable. The voice of a man seated somewhere warm, with no intention of moving anytime soon. I told him I needed to get to the hospital. I told him something was wrong. There was the briefest pause. Then he said his car had broken down on the highway. Not frustrated, not rushed, just smooth, like he had already settled into the sentence before speaking it aloud. He told me to call Julian because he was too far out to make it back quickly. I remember staring at the cabinet across from me after he hung up. My hand was shaking hard enough that the phone nearly slipped from my fingers. For a moment, my brain did something merciful and stupid at the same time. It tried to protect me. Maybe the car really broke down. Maybe he sounded calm because he was trying not to scare me. Maybe the pain in my chest tightened sharply enough to cut the thought in half. I called Julian. It rang until voicemail. That was the moment the fear finally reached me. Not the dramatic kind, not screaming panic. Worse, the quiet understanding that if something truly happened to me that night, I was alone on a kitchen floor trying to bargain with people who were unavailable. So I called my daughter. Camille answered immediately. I told her what was happening, that I couldn't get myself to the hospital, that her father's car had broken down somewhere outside the city. There was silence on the line. Short, tight. Then her voice changed in a way I had never heard before. "Mom," she said carefully, "his car isn't broken down." I closed my eyes. She told me she was at a lounge across town with Kendrick after work. She saw Dave when she walked in, but spent nearly an hour convincing herself she had to be mistaken. She kept waiting for some explanation to appear naturally. A client meeting, a coincidence, somebody else sitting nearby. But there wasn't one. Dave was there with Lynette, my best friend of 22 years. Laughing, relaxed, sitting close enough that his hand rested over hers like it belonged there. I was still on the kitchen floor. I wish I could tell you I became strategic immediately, that my mind sharpened and everything inside me turned cold and focused. That is not what happened. What happened was smaller and far more humiliating. I stopped speaking because I genuinely could not make my body process both things at once, the pain in my chest and the image my daughter had just handed me. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming behind me and my own breathing sounding strangely uneven in my ears. Camille kept saying my name softly. "Mom? Mom?" Then something old inside me steadied itself. Not rage. Instinct. I asked her if they had seen her. She said no. I asked if she was certain. She said yes. Then I told her quietly, "Don't confront them. Just take a few pictures if you can without being obvious. Then leave and come get me." She went silent for one beat. Camille works in corporate marketing. Half her job is documenting events without people noticing the camera first. When she finally answered, her voice had gone completely controlled. "Okay," she said. "If you're watching this right now, drop your location in the comments. I want to know where in the world this story is reaching." Camille got to the house 20 minutes later. She moved fast but not recklessly, got me off the floor carefully, helped me into the car, buckled me in like she was afraid if she moved too suddenly something else would break. She didn't mention her father again during the drive. I watched her hands on the steering wheel instead. Tight grip, controlled breathing, jaw locked hard enough to ache by morning, I imagine. She had just seen her father with my best friend while her mother lay sick on a kitchen floor calling for help. And somehow she was still the calmest person in the car. At the hospital, they admitted me quickly. Chest pain buys attention fast. Nurses moved in efficient circles around me while monitors beeped steadily beside the bed. One nurse asked whether my husband was coming. I heard myself say, "He couldn't make it." She nodded once and wrote something down without reacting. By midnight, I was lying in a hospital bed staring at ceiling tiles while Dave still had not called to ask whether I was alive. Not once. I picked up my phone, looked at his name, put it back down again. Camille came back into the room after speaking to one of the nurses. She sat beside me quietly for a moment before unlocking her phone. "I only got a few," she said softly. Then she turned the screen toward me. I had prepared myself for the information. I had not prepared myself for the ease on his face. That was the part that reached me. Not guilt, not secrecy, comfort. I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I looked at my daughter. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. I handed the phone back, turned toward the ceiling again, and said quietly, "Don't say anything to anybody yet." Camille studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Okay," she said. Camille fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning. She hadn't meant to. One moment she was sitting upright in that stiff hospital chair watching every monitor in the room like she personally intended to keep my heart beating. And the next her head had tilted slightly against the wall and her breathing slowed into something uneven and exhausted. I lay there listening to it. Hospitals sound different at night. Less movement, more machines. Every sound feels separated from the next by too much space. I watched my daughter sleeping beside my bed and thought about the fact that she had gone out that evening expecting nothing heavier than dinner and conversation. Somewhere between walking into that lounge and walking out of it, she had picked up a truth that belonged to me before I even knew it existed. And she carried it carefully. That mattered to me more than I could explain yet. When she woke the next morning, she looked at me before she fully opened her eyes. The kind of instinct people have when they fall asleep, afraid something will happen while they aren't looking. I told her I was okay. It wasn't fully true, but it was true enough for that moment. She sat up slowly, rubbed one hand over her face, then reached automatically for her phone before stopping herself halfway through the motion. We looked at each other for a second and understood we were no longer avoiding the conversation. She walked me through everything carefully. The lounge was crowded enough that nobody paid attention to people minding their own business. She and Kendrick had been seated near the back at first. She recognized Dave almost immediately when she walked in, but her brain refused to settle on it right away. She kept waiting for context to fix what she was seeing. A client meeting, an accidental overlap, Lynette stopping by briefly. Something normal. But the longer she sat there, the less normal it looked. She said the worst part wasn't what they were doing, it was how comfortable they were doing it. No tension, no caution, no distance being maintained in case somebody recognized them. Just ease. When I called and repeated Dave's story about his car breaking down on the highway, Camille said her stomach dropped immediately. Because then she knew, not suspected. Knew. I asked her how long they'd been there before she arrived. She said she couldn't say exactly, but they behaved like people continuing an evening, not beginning one. She noticed half-finished drinks already on the table when she walked in. Familiar posture. Relaxed conversation. The kind of silence people fall into comfortably when they have already spent time together. Then I asked whether anyone noticed her taking the pictures. Camille hesitated briefly before answering, and that hesitation actually reassured me more than confidence would have. It meant she had thought about it honestly instead of trying to impress me with certainty. She told me she waited until she stepped away to the restroom area first. She circled back through another section of the lounge afterward and only took a few quick photos while pretending to check messages. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. That sounded real. Camille works in corporate marketing. Half her career involves moving through crowded rooms, documenting events without interrupting them. She wasn't trained for betrayal, but she was trained not to draw attention to herself while holding a phone. That difference mattered. Then I asked whether she noticed anything else. She thought for a second before mentioning the silver sedan parked near the side exit, Dave's cousin's car. She recognized it because it had been at our house enough times over the years for the shape of it to settle into memory naturally. She said it only stood out because she remembered Dave claiming he was stranded somewhere outside the city. The car had no reason to be there if the story was true. I didn't react outwardly. I just stored it away quietly with everything else. Then I asked about Kendrick. That answer mattered to me for reasons bigger than that night. Camille said he stayed calm after realizing what was happening, didn't push her to confront anyone, didn't start performing outrage to prove himself useful. He let her decide what to do and followed her lead once she made the decision. I asked her what kind of man does that. She thought about it before answering. A careful one, she said. I nodded once. Then she handed me the phone. I looked at the pictures first, then the short video clip. What surprised me most was not the betrayal itself. Somewhere deep down, I think women often know long before they admit they know. What unsettled me was the absence of strain on Dave's face. Comfort. That was the word my mind kept returning to. Comfort sitting beside another woman while I lay on a kitchen floor, trying to breathe steadily enough to dial a phone. I watched everything twice. Not emotionally. Professionally. I reviewed it the same way I review client documents. What is confirmed? What is assumption? What would another person reasonably conclude from this? That distinction matters. Emotion makes people sloppy. I have spent 20 years in financial work watching small emotional assumptions destroy otherwise solid cases. The footage confirmed enough. I handed the phone back and told Camille to back everything up in multiple places. Cloud storage, email, whatever she trusted most. Then I told her something more important. Act like it doesn't exist. She studied me for a moment after that, not confused, just realizing I had already moved mentally into a place she hadn't reached yet. Then the room door opened. Dave walked in carrying flowers. Hospital gift shop flowers too expensive enough to look thoughtful, generic enough to be purchased in under 2 minutes by a man trying to arrive looking prepared. His face was arranged carefully. Concern softened around the eyes, mouth set low, every expression placed exactly where it belonged. Camille went completely still beside me. I looked at him for one long second. Then I smiled softly and opened my hand toward him. Baby, I said warmly, you made it. Relief, tenderness. A wife grateful her husband finally arrived. Camille turned toward me so fast I felt it more than saw it. I didn't look back at her, because in that exact moment, sitting in that hospital bed watching Dave perform concern he had not earned, something inside me made its first clean decision. Not revenge. Not yet. Something quieter. Observation. And once I started observing him clearly, I realized I had probably stopped truly seeing my husband years ago. Dave pulled the chair close to my hospital bed and took my hand with both of his like a man who had spent the entire night terrified. He started explaining before I asked a single question. That was the first thing I noticed. A man telling the truth usually waits for the conversation to reach him naturally. Dave arrived already halfway inside the story. The highway, the exit ramp, the dead battery, the tow truck that supposedly took 2 hours to arrive. The details came too smoothly, fitted together too tightly. Every transition polished clean before it reached my ears. Not rehearsed enough to sound theatrical, rehearsed enough to sound prepared. I listened quietly. I asked soft questions in the places a wife normally would. Which highway, baby? Did the insurance company send roadside assistance? Were you alone out there the whole time? Nothing sharp, nothing confrontational. I wasn't trying to catch him. I was trying to observe him. That is an important difference. People become careless when they think the danger is emotional. Dave was prepared for tears, accusations, hurt feelings. He was not prepared for quiet attention. So I listened to every extra detail he volunteered unnecessarily, every place his timeline shifted slightly between sentences, every moment his eyes moved away before answering something simple. I touched nothing. I just collected. Camille stayed mostly silent beside the bed. She answered when spoken to, but nothing more. About 20 minutes into the conversation, she stood and said she was going downstairs for coffee. Before she reached the door, she glanced back at me briefly. Not for instruction. For reassurance. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Stay calm. Not here. She understood immediately and walked out without another word. Once we were alone, Dave relaxed slightly. That interested me too. Not consciously. His body simply loosened once the witness left the room. I let the conversation drift naturally towards safer ground, the business. Long-term plans, future contracts. The kinds of things people talk about when they're trying to reassure themselves life is still stable. Dave responded instantly. That was always the subject that animated him most. He leaned back in the chair slightly, and his voice changed in that familiar way it always did when discussing the company. Fuller, more confident. Like the room belonged to him again. My clients are solid, he said. The contracts are structured well. What I built doesn't shake easily. What I built? I noticed that too. I smiled softly and told him that was good to hear. Then I asked about expansion plans, upcoming projects, staffing concerns. Ordinary questions a financially involved wife would naturally ask after a medical scare reminded her life could change unexpectedly. Dave answered easily, calmly, confidently. Too confidently for a man whose wife had spent hours in a hospital bed after he failed to come when she called. At one point, he stepped out to grab coffee downstairs. The moment the door closed behind him, Camille looked at me carefully. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded once. Then I asked her for something simple instead. I told her to text me every photo and video she had taken the night before, so the originals existed in more than one place, not because I thought she would lose them, because experience teaches you important things disappear at the worst possible moments. She sent everything immediately. Timestamps included automatically. That mattered more to me than hidden recordings or dramatic confrontations ever could. Clean timelines survive scrutiny better than emotional reactions. By the time Dave returned with coffee cups in his hands, my phone was face down beside me, and my expression had settled back into something softer. He stayed another hour. Before leaving, he kissed my forehead gently and told me he would come back tomorrow after checking on a few things at the office. I smiled and told him to drive safely. That phrase sat strangely between us for half a second. Then he left. I waited until the hallway quieted again before picking up my phone. There were already 2 texts from him sent while he rode downstairs in the elevator. "Glad you're feeling better. Scared me last night." I stared at the screen for a long moment. A man who had not called once while I was being admitted to the hospital was now documenting concern carefully in writing. Interesting. I screenshotted the messages and forwarded them into a private email account I had maintained for years. Originally, it existed for financial backups and emergency records. Looking at it now, I realized some part of me had always needed a place where important things could exist untouched. Later that evening, before discharge discussions began, I asked the nurse whether the hospital had a patient advocate available. She did. The woman arrived carrying a slim folder and introduced herself quietly before sitting beside the bed. I chose my words carefully, not dramatically, not vindictively. I simply explained the timeline honestly. I told her I had experienced chest pain, severe enough to require emergency admission, that my daughter transported me, that my husband was unreachable initially despite being my listed emergency contact, that I arrived frightened and physically unable to drive myself safely. Nothing more. The advocate wrote everything down in neat, deliberate lines. I watched her pen move across the paper and understood something important in that moment. Memory fades. Documentation doesn't. After she left, the room settled into silence again. Then my phone buzzed. "Lynette. Heard you were in the hospital, girl. So sorry. Let me know if you need anything." I read the message twice. Not because I was confused, because I was suddenly aware of how many years a person can sit across from you smiling while living an entirely separate life behind their teeth. I set the phone face down on the blanket beside me and closed my eyes. Something moved through me then. Not rage exactly. Something colder, smaller, more permanent. And for the first time since this began, I realized the most dangerous part of betrayal is not discovering people lied to you. It's discovering how naturally they did it. I came home to a husband who suddenly remembered how to hover. Dave brought tea without being asked. He checked on me constantly. If I shifted in bed, he appeared in the doorway asking whether I needed another pillow. If I stayed quiet too long downstairs, he came looking for me with that carefully arranged concern sitting across his face like he'd practiced it in the car mirror before walking inside. 3 weeks earlier, I had been on a kitchen floor struggling to breathe while he laughed beside another woman. Now he noticed every cough. That contrast stayed with me more than the affair itself some days. Not because the attention comforted me, because it revealed something ugly about timing. A man who becomes attentive only after almost losing access to you is not reacting to love. He is reacting to threat. I let him react. Partly because my body truly was recovering. The hospital scare had not been imaginary. Some mornings my chest still tightened sharply if I moved too fast. Fatigue arrived suddenly and without warning. My doctor called it manageable, if I respected recovery properly. So I moved slower than usual, rested more visibly than usual. And underneath all of that, I started paying attention. What I was paying attention to was the business. For years, Dave and I divided responsibilities naturally enough that the separation stopped feeling intentional. I handled the broad financial structure approvals, forecasting, tax coordination, long-range planning. Dave handled operational activity, vendor movement, account maintenance, day-to-day processing. At least that was the arrangement on paper. In marriage, arrangements become habits. Habits become assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous things to build companies on. I started reviewing the accounts on a Tuesday evening after Dave went downstairs to watch television. I remember the exact sound of the living room carrying faintly through the floorboards while I opened the laptop at the dining room table. Sports commentary, commercial breaks, ice shifting in a glass every so often when he picked up his drink. Ordinary sounds. That was the strange part. Betrayal almost never arrives inside dramatic music. Most of the time it unfolds while somebody is downstairs asking if you want extra butter on your popcorn. I wasn't searching for proof yet. That would have been emotional. Emotional people jump toward conclusions because they want relief more than clarity. I just read, line by line, month by month. The first irregularity was small enough to almost disappear naturally, a transfer amount slightly higher than the approved invoice attached to it. Not dramatically higher, just off enough that my eyes paused. The second thing was stranger. A vendor note tied to a payment that had no matching documentation anywhere else in the system. I opened another window, cross-checked dates, reviewed approval logs. Nothing. Not proof, just absence. Dave came upstairs around 9:30 carrying a bowl of fruit and leaned against the doorway watching me. "What are you working on?" he asked lightly. I looked up slowly enough to appear interrupted instead of alert. "Personal files," I said. "Lying around all day is making me restless." His expression softened immediately. Relief disguised itself quickly across his face before concern settled back over it again. "Don't overdo it," he said. I smiled. "I won't." He stood there another second too long before heading back downstairs. I listened to his footsteps disappear. Then I opened the account history again. The second evening sharpened the shape further. What unsettled me most was not sloppiness, it was precision. Whoever moved the money understood exactly how businesses camouflage small irregularities naturally. The amounts varied, timing varied, descriptions varied. Nothing repeated closely enough to trigger casual attention, but I was not reading casually anymore. I built those reporting structures myself years ago. I knew what normal movement looked like because I helped create the patterns normal business activity leaves behind. And this wasn't normal. Around 10, Dave called from the kitchen, asking whether I wanted soup or pasta for dinner. I answered warmly that pasta sounded good. Then I muted my microphone and sat there staring at the screen, feeling something uncomfortable settle into place beneath my ribs. Not outrage. Recognition. Because suddenly I remembered conversations from the last 2 years differently. The month Dave told me client payments were delayed and we needed to tighten spending temporarily. The weekend I canceled furniture I'd already postponed twice because he said the business cushion felt thinner than expected. The consulting work I quietly picked up to help stabilize things during a supposedly difficult quarter. I had been adjusting my life around pressure, he described, while money moved quietly somewhere else underneath the description. That realization landed harder than the transfers themselves. I kept reading. One payment near the bottom of a quarterly statement almost escaped me entirely because it was so ordinary looking. Small amount. Routine formatting. Buried naturally between legitimate operational activity. I nearly scrolled past it. Then my eyes caught the account name attached to the transfer. And stopped. Not a vendor. Not a contractor. A woman I had known for 22 years. Lynette. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to the dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen while the name stayed on the screen in front of me. Downstairs, my husband was setting the table for dinner. I opened a blank document slowly. Then I typed 3 headings across the top. What I know, what I can prove, what I still need. Under the first column, I wrote her name. Then I closed the laptop, fixed my face into something gentle and unsuspecting, and went downstairs to have dinner with my husband. 3 weeks after the hospital, I was moving steadily again. Not fully. My body still reminded me at random hours that it had been through something serious. Some mornings my chest tightened sharply if I moved too quickly. Some nights exhaustion arrived without warning and settled deep into my bones before dinner was even finished. But I could think clearly again. And clear thinking is dangerous when you've spent years accepting explanations that no longer survive inspection. I made the call to Rochelle O'Neill on a Thursday morning while Dave was at the office. Her name came through a professional contact of mine quietly. The way these referrals usually move among women who have spent enough years in business to understand discretion is sometimes more valuable than brilliance. Rochelle handled financial disputes, partnership conflicts, complex divorces. More importantly, she had no overlap with Dave, professionally or socially. That mattered. I scheduled the appointment under the pretense of updating my estate documents. That part was not entirely a lie. But before I walked into her office, I needed to understand exactly what I was carrying into it. So I drove to the storage unit. The documents were exactly where I left them years ago, organized in weatherproof boxes, labeled carefully in my handwriting. Dave used to joke that I treated paperwork like family heirlooms. He liked to tease me about keeping duplicate records of things we already had digitally. Standing there that morning, I realized my caution had quietly outlived his mockery. I brought everything home and spread the files across the dining room table after making certain Dave was settled at work for the day. Incorporation papers, original licensing documents, early tax filings, operational frameworks, loan approvals. I moved through them slowly. The first business loan application stopped me longer than I expected it to, 11 years old. My signature sat beneath the personal guarantee section. My credit profile had been used as the primary stability factor because Dave's business history alone wasn't strong enough yet for favorable approval terms. My professional credentials were listed extensively throughout the supporting documentation. I sat there staring at my own name for a long time. Not emotionally. Honestly. Over the years, Dave became the visible side of the company, while I remained the structural side of it. That division happened gradually enough that it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like personality. He was naturally better in rooms, better at sales, better at visibility. I preferred systems, operations, compliance, long-range planning. At least that's what I told myself. But the further back I went through the documents, the harder it became to ignore the full picture. 4 of our first 6 clients came directly through my professional relationships. People who signed because they trusted my reputation, not his. The internal operational framework still being used company-wide had been written by me over 4 consecutive weekends while Dave focused on client acquisition. Even the employee onboarding structure came from templates I originally built during my corporate years before we launched the business. None of this made Dave fraudulent. That distinction mattered to me. He worked hard. He helped build the company. He grew it aggressively once it stabilized. But somewhere over time, visibility quietly became ownership in everyone's minds, including mine. I had spent years saying our business, while unconsciously allowing the world to interpret it as his accomplishment, with my support attached quietly in the background. Sitting there at that table, I realized those are not the same thing. I kept reading. Not every document strengthened my position either, and oddly enough, that made me trust my own assessment more. Some early contracts existed entirely because of Dave's persistence. Some operational failures had been my responsibility, not his. One expansion proposal I strongly opposed ended up becoming profitable later despite my concerns. Reality looked mixed. Real businesses usually do. By the time I closed the second storage box, I finally understood what I was actually looking at. Not a husband who built everything alone, and not a wife secretly responsible for all of it either. What I was looking at was a company built by 2 people where one slowly became visible while the other became assumed. That realization landed harder because it was true. I photographed everything relevant carefully and organized the files in a clean sequence Rochelle could review efficiently later. Then I packed the documents away, wiped down the table, and started dinner before Dave came home. At 6:40, he walked through the front door carrying more energy than I'd seen from him in weeks. A potential new contract, major client, large expansion opportunity, could take the business to another level. He talked through most of dinner, animated in the way successful men become when they can already see themselves standing inside the future before it arrives. His hands moved while he spoke, his voice sharpened with excitement. I listened, asked good questions, told him it sounded promising, and the strange part was that none of my reactions were fake. I did understand the business. I did understand the opportunity. I probably understood parts of the risk better than he did. That was the irony sitting between us. After dinner, Dave went upstairs to shower while I remained alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for running water somewhere above me. I looked around slowly. At the home. At the files hidden away again. At the life that had spent years arranging itself around one version of the story. Dave believed he was preparing for the next stage of expansion. And maybe he was. But sitting there alone in that kitchen, I realized something he still didn't. Before anything grows, ownership gets examined first. And for the first time in 11 years, I had finally started examining mine. I went back to the accounts on a Friday morning. Dave had left early for a client meeting. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen and the occasional vibration from my phone against the dining room table. I ignored the phone. What sat in front of me mattered more. My laptop, my coffee, and the document I had started several days earlier. 3 columns. What I know, what I can prove, what still feels wrong. One name already sat quietly beneath the first heading. Lynette. I opened the business accounts and started from the beginning, instead of searching for specific transactions. Emotional people search for confirmation first. They jump toward the thing they already fear and start arranging every detail around it afterward. I wasn't trying to prove Dave guilty yet. I was trying to understand what was actually there. So I reviewed everything. The first transfer that caught my attention was 14 months old, small enough to disappear naturally inside ordinary operational movement. The amount resembled a reimbursement adjustment or contractor correction, exactly the kind of routine activity businesses process every week without discussion. At first, I nearly cleared it myself. There was even a vendor note attached that looked legitimate on casual review, but something about the timing bothered me enough to keep reading. 20 minutes later, I realized the payment itself was real, just unrelated to the notation attached beside it. 2 separate transactions had been coded similarly within days of each other, creating the appearance of explanation where none actually existed. Not proof, but not clean either. I leaned back slowly in my chair and forced myself to pause. That mattered. Because once betrayal enters a person's bloodstream, suspicion starts trying to turn every irregularity into evidence. I had spent too many years in financial services watching smart people destroy their own credibility by becoming emotionally attached to conclusions before the paperwork actually supported them. I refused to become one of them, so I started over again more carefully. The second transfer appeared 6 weeks later. Different amount, different notation. No matching invoice, then another surfaced 2 months after that. Then 2 smaller ones inside the same quarter positioned just far enough apart that your eye would never naturally group them together unless you were reviewing extended activity side by side. That was the moment my attention sharpened fully. Not because the amounts were enormous, because they were disciplined. I have spent 20 years reviewing financial behavior professionally. Most people imagine deception looks dramatic. Huge withdrawals, reckless spending, obvious patterns repeated loudly enough to trigger alarms. Real concealment rarely looks like that. Real concealment survives because it stays small enough to feel forgettable. I exported 2 years of account activity into a spreadsheet and started mapping transfers manually. Halfway through, I stopped again. One payment I initially flagged turned out entirely legitimate after deeper review. An independent contractor had temporarily switched processing systems during a software migration, which explained the unfamiliar routing information and inconsistent notation. I stared at the correction quietly for a long moment. Oddly enough, finding something innocent steadied me emotionally. It reminded me this process was still honest. I wasn't trying to build a revenge narrative. I was trying to understand reality clearly, even if reality eventually became smaller or messier than betrayal likes to imagine itself. So I kept going, carefully. By late afternoon, the shape became harder to dismiss. The transfers varied intentionally uneven amounts, inconsistent spacing, different labels, different routing descriptions. Individually, none of them would attract serious concern inside a functioning business. Together, they formed something else entirely: intentional obscurity. I totaled the amounts twice because the first number didn't feel emotionally proportional to what I was discovering. Not catastrophic. That almost made it worse. If the money had been enormous, outrage would have arrived quickly and cleanly. Instead, what settled over me was something quieter and far more exhausting. The realization that Dave had been describing financial pressure to me while money moved somewhere else underneath the conversation. That was the part that hollowed something out inside me. Not the amount. The cooperation I thought we were sharing while I adjusted my own behavior around information that wasn't fully true. I opened old calendar entries next. Not business calendars. Personal honors. The month Dave sat across from me at this same table explaining that several client payments were delayed and we needed to tighten spending temporarily. I remembered canceling a furniture order I'd postponed for nearly a year already because I didn't want additional pressure landing on the business while things were supposedly unstable. Another month, I accepted outside consulting work to help rebuild what I believed was a shrinking cushion. I worked longer hours while money quietly exited the structure I was trying to help protect. That realization stayed with me longer than the transfers themselves. Around 5:30, I closed the spreadsheet and sat there in silence for a while before organizing everything into chronological order for Rochelle. Not accusations. Documentation. There is a difference. Before shutting down the laptop, I searched one more thing: Lynette's professional history. Public business registrations are not difficult to access if you know where to look and how to read them properly. Most people simply never bother moving past surface information. I reviewed expired LLC filings, dissolved partnerships, consulting registrations, inactive lifestyle ventures. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Honestly, most of it looked ordinary at first glance. A lot of capable people try businesses that don't survive long term. That alone meant nothing. I made myself remember that carefully. But after 2 hours inside those records, a quieter pattern emerged. Lynette rarely stayed independent for very long. Her ventures almost always positioned themselves adjacent to somebody else's existing structure, funding, client network, or professional stability. And once I saw that pattern clearly, something uncomfortable settled into place behind my ribs. I had been one of those structures too, for 22 years. My phone rang suddenly against the table, hard enough to make me flinch slightly. Lynette. I stared at her name lighting up across the screen. Once, twice, 4 times. I let every call go to voicemail. For a moment, I considered listening immediately. Then I realized I wasn't ready to hear her pretending normal life still existed between us. Not yet. So instead, I screenshotted the missed calls with the timestamps visible and saved them into the folder already building quietly on my desktop. Filet. Then I closed the laptop, stood slowly from the table, and went into the kitchen to start dinner before Dave came home. Because one of the strangest parts of betrayal is realizing the world keeps asking ordinary things from you while your understanding of your own life rearranges itself underneath your feet. Rochelle called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through paperwork from my latest cardiology follow-up. The house was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows over the sink. I remember because the sound almost covered the hesitation in Rochelle's voice when she first started speaking. Attorneys develop a particular tone when they are deciding how carefully information needs to be carried into a conversation. She said someone had reached out indirectly regarding my situation. Not a formal witness. Not a sworn statement. Just information passed cautiously through professional channels. I leaned back slowly in my chair and waited. Rochelle explained that one of her colleagues had been approached by a man connected loosely to Dave's business circle. The man did not want official involvement unless absolutely necessary. He was worried about future subpoenas, professional fallout, office politics, All the ordinary fears people develop once lawyers enter a situation that previously felt like gossip. That part made immediate sense to me. People enjoy scandal comfortably, right up until paperwork starts attaching names to it. Then everybody suddenly remembers careers exist. I already knew who it was before Rochelle said the name. Julian. And honestly, the route fit him perfectly. Not dishonest. Not courageous either. Just the kind of man who prefers difficult truths delivered from an angle instead of directly through the front door. According to Rochelle, Julian had been at the lounge that same night. Not with Dave. Separately. He arrived earlier in the evening for a client drink, noticed Dave and Lynette almost immediately, understood exactly what he was looking at, and left not long afterward. No confrontation. No dramatic scene. No warning call to me later that night. At first, something hot moved through my chest when I heard that. Not outrage exactly. Disappointment. Because Julian had sat at my table for 11 years. Holidays, backyard cookouts, business dinners. He watched me build a life beside Dave piece by piece and still found a way to convince himself silence counted as staying out of it. But as Rochelle continued talking, the shape underneath the situation became clearer. Julian did not finally speak because the affair bothered him most. He spoke because Dave used his name. That detail stayed with him. After word spread quietly that I had been hospitalized that night, Julian eventually learned Dave told me his car had broken down and instructed me to call him for help instead. Julian never agreed to that, never knew his name had been inserted into the lie, never even saw my missed call until much later that evening. According to Rochelle's contact, Julian kept circling back to that specific part during the conversation. A woman struggling to breathe on a kitchen floor had been redirected toward him while Dave stayed comfortably inside that lounge. Not impulsively, deliberately. And honestly, I understood why that disturbed him more deeply than the affair itself. Infidelity is ugly, but using another person's name as emotional cover while your wife is calling for medical help reaches somewhere colder inside people once they truly sit with it. Julian still did not contact me directly. Part of me resented that. Another part understood him perfectly. Some men are only capable of approaching truth sideways. They need emotional distance from damage before they can admit clearly what they witnessed. So Julian spoke quietly to someone else. That person spoke carefully to Rochelle, and eventually the timeline reached me intact. The most important part was not emotional anyway. It was structural. Julian independently placed Dave inside that lounge during the exact time frame Dave claimed he was stranded on the highway. More importantly, his recollection aligned naturally with Camille's account, without sounding rehearsed alongside it. Not identical. Better than identical. Human. Camille remembered details Julian didn't. Julian remembered timing anchors Camille missed. Small differences existed exactly where real memory usually creates them. That reassured me more than perfect consistency ever could have. Real witnesses rarely recall life like movie scenes. They remember fragments. Lighting. Positioning. What somebody was wearing. The feeling of a room. The fact that Julian and Camille described overlapping realities instead of matching scripts made both accounts stronger in my eyes. When Rochelle finished explaining everything, I thanked her quietly and started ending the call. Then she stopped me. "One more thing," she said. Her office had already forwarded portions of my business documentation to a valuation specialist for preliminary review. Not a television-style forensic investigation, just a professional assessment of ownership contribution, liability exposure, and foundational business structure in preparation for potential financial proceedings. The specialist needed additional incorporation records, original financing documents, personal guarantees, credential verification paperwork. I told Rochelle I still had everything archived carefully. There was a short pause before she spoke again. "The assessor wanted me to phrase this carefully," she said. I waited. "He believes your role in the company's early viability appears materially larger than what courts typically classify as standard spousal support." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. That is how professionals summarize entire marriages sometimes. Materially larger than standard. I asked what it meant practically, and I appreciated Rochelle for answering like an attorney instead of a friend. She explained that valuation numbers are not cash waiting neatly inside an account somewhere. Businesses carry debt exposure, liabilities, tax obligations, operational risk, contractual dependencies. Numbers shift once accountants, courts, and negotiations start touching them. But based on the documentation reviewed so far, my role in securing, structuring, and stabilizing Elevate during its earliest years appeared substantial enough that it would likely matter significantly during division discussions. Then she gave me a preliminary estimate range. Not fantasy wealth, not RevengeStory millions falling from the sky overnight. Real numbers. Complex numbers. Numbers tied to ownership exposure, growth, equity appreciation, and long-term operational value. I wrote them slowly onto the notepad beside my coffee cup. Then I sat there staring at the figures for a long time after the call ended, not because I suddenly felt wealthy, because for 19 years I had quietly trained myself to describe my role smaller than it actually was. And sitting there alone at my kitchen table, with rain tapping softly against the windows, I realized something uncomfortable and strangely freeing at the same time. Betrayal had forced me to look directly at parts of my own life I might otherwise have continued undervaluing forever. Camille started coming by every few days after I came home from the hospital. She never announced it as concern. Instead, she texted things like, "Already near your neighborhood, need anything?" Or, "I made too much pasta again." Sometimes she simply appeared at the back door carrying grocery bags or food containers from her apartment, transferred carefully into my dishes, as if changing the container somehow disguised the effort behind it. I noticed anyway. I have always noticed effort. What I noticed even more was what she wasn't saying. Camille moved through the house carefully now, not nervously carefully, like she was constantly monitoring herself for emotional leakage. She laughed when appropriate, answered questions normally, went to work every day. But there was a new restraint in her that hadn't existed before that night at the lounge. She had become protective around me in a way children sometimes do after they witness a parent break unexpectedly. And the truth was, she had been carrying that night almost as heavily as I had. Not because I asked her to, because love creates witnesses whether people want the position or not. I brought up Kendrick one Wednesday evening while she unpacked groceries onto my kitchen counter after work. I did not frame it as strategy. I did not say witness. I simply asked questions. What exactly did Kendrick see that night? She said everything important. The table placement. Dave and Lynette sitting close together. The length of time they remained there after she noticed them. Kendrick had a clear view from where they sat and paid attention once he realized something was wrong. What did he specifically remember about the sequence of events? That answer took her longer. Not because she was inventing details, because she was sorting memory honestly instead of dramatically. She said he remembered the broad sequence clearly arriving at the lounge, recognizing Dave, waiting to see whether there was an explanation, my phone call coming through, Camille stepping away briefly afterward, and the two of them leaving together shortly after. Some smaller details differed between what she remembered and what he remembered. Again, that reassured me. Real memory usually overlaps imperfectly. Then I asked the question that mattered most to me. What kind of man is he when something serious is happening? Camille stopped unpacking for a second. Then she said quietly, "The kind that doesn't make it about himself." That answer told me more than anything else she could have said. I asked her to invite him over Sunday afternoon. Nothing formal. No warning. No agenda, explained. Just lunch. She looked at me for a moment before nodding slowly. Sunday came warm and quiet. I cooked enough food for people to settle into conversation naturally without feeling interrogated. Kendrick arrived carrying dessert from a bakery across town and apologized immediately for being 10 minutes late because traffic near the interstate had backed up unexpectedly. Small detail. But I notice punctuality because people reveal themselves in how they handle minor inconveniences. Some men arrive late and pretend time is flexible. Some acknowledge it directly. Kendrick acknowledged it directly. Interesting. We sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours. Most of the conversation had nothing to do with the lounge or Dave or Lynette. Work, family, housing prices, his parents living outside Charlotte. Camille rolling her eyes at one story from college. I watched how he answered ordinary questions first. That matters too. People who exaggerate small things usually exaggerate large ones eventually. Kendrick didn't. When the conversation naturally brushed near that night, he did not suddenly perform outrage or become theatrically uncomfortable. He answered directly when spoken to. No embellishment, no attempt to sound heroic. No eagerness to involve himself deeper than necessary. At one point, I asked casually whether he almost said something to Dave at the lounge. He admitted yes. Then admitted Camille stopping him was probably the correct decision. That honesty mattered to me too. Most people rewrite themselves into cleaner versions once conflict begins. Kendrick didn't seem interested in polishing himself. By the time he finished his second plate, I understood why Camille trusted him. Steady people are easy to underestimate because they don't announce themselves loudly. After he left, Camille stayed behind to help clean the kitchen. We moved quietly around each other for a while before she finally leaned back against the counter and looked at me carefully. Not about Rochelle, not about legal filings, not about evidence. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked softly. She meant emotionally. I dried my hands slowly before answering. And for the first time since all this started, I considered lying to her. Not because I wanted to deceive her. Because children carry enough already without inheriting the full emotional collapse of their parents too. But Camille was old enough to recognize dishonesty even when wrapped gently. So I answered carefully instead. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm becoming okay." That was closer to the truth. Because healing had not arrived cleanly or completely. Some nights I still woke up angry. Some mornings, humiliation sat so sharply in my chest I could barely finish coffee without replaying that kitchen floor in my mind again. But beneath all of it, something else had started growing too. Clarity. Camille studied my face like she was deciding whether the answer satisfied her or whether she simply needed to accept it for now. Finally, she nodded once. The following week, Kendrick provided a brief written account through Rochelle's office after she requested one formally, short, specific, limited only to what he personally observed. No dramatic language, no speculation beyond what he actually saw. Exactly the kind of statement believable people give. That same evening, Camille stopped by after work, carrying a small storage box from my home office. "I was organizing some of the old files you asked me to sort last week," she said casually. That part was true. During recovery, I had asked her to help separate outdated tax records and archived business paperwork because lifting heavier boxes still exhausted me faster than it should have. She hesitated near the front door before continuing. "I found this folded inside one of the old partnership folders." She handed me a piece of paper folded so many times the creases had nearly softened white. "I don't know if it matters," she said. "It just felt important." Then she left before I could ask anything else. I unfolded the paper slowly in the hallway light, read the first few lines, and stood there long after Camille's headlights disappeared from the street outside. The paper Camille handed me had a company name printed across the top, nothing dramatic. Just a logo, a date, and an email address I recognized immediately as one I used several years earlier. The document had been folded enough times that the edges had softened. Camille found it buried inside an archived folder while sorting old records from my office exactly where I would have left it after deciding not to revisit the subject anymore. I knew what it was before I finished reading the first paragraph. Still, I sat down at my desk and searched the company anyway. The website appeared immediately, clean design, established branding, the kind of professional polish businesses develop over time through steady growth instead of overnight hype. Then I found the press coverage. Regional features first. Industry mentions. Eventually, national recognition. I opened an interview from about 18 months earlier and started reading. The founder's name was Desmond Carrington. 3 years ago, he approached me about joining him in launching a consulting and operations firm built around mid-market corporate restructuring. We met twice in person, spoke on the phone several more times. The opportunity was serious enough that I drafted preliminary notes, reviewed partnership structures, and spent several weeks genuinely considering whether I wanted to step into something new professionally. At the time, Dave encouraged me publicly. That mattered too. He told people he was proud of me for being considered, told me I deserved opportunities of my own. But privately, the conversations around it always became more complicated somehow. timing concerns, stress concerns, questions about balance, what it would mean for our marriage if both of us were consumed professionally at the same time. None of those concerns were unreasonable on their own. That is what made them effective. In the article, Desmond spoke about the early years of the company, unstable cash flow, staffing problems, difficult growth decisions. Near the end of the interview, the reporter asked whether he always intended to build the company alone. According to the transcript, he paused before answering. Then, he said, there was originally someone else he hoped would join him at the start, someone whose operational background would have strengthened the company significantly early on. But after serious consideration, she ultimately decided not to move forward. He never used my name. He didn't need to. I sat there staring at the screen, reading about a version of my life that branched away quietly 3 years earlier. Not stolen. Not forced away from me. Chosen away from. That distinction became important the longer I sat there, because memory has a dangerous habit of rewriting itself once betrayal enters the room. Suddenly, every old conversation starts looking sinister if you stare at it long enough. I forced myself not to do that. Lynette did not manipulate me like a mastermind in some thriller movie. She did not secretly sabotage contracts or engineer my decisions from behind the scenes. The truth was more human than that. During those weeks when I considered joining Desmond, Lynette became the voice that consistently reinforced my hesitation. She called often, asked thoughtful questions, reminded me how much pressure I already carried, wondered aloud whether starting something new at this stage of life might exhaust me unnecessarily. And the uncomfortable part was this: some of what she said was probably sincere. That is what betrayal rarely allows people to admit publicly. Sometimes the person hurting you also genuinely cares about you in smaller ways at the same time. Human beings are messy enough for both things to coexist. But sitting there at my desk, reading about what Desmond built afterward, I also had to admit something else. Lynette consistently encouraged the version of my life that kept me smaller, safer, more available to support everyone else's expansion. And I listened because part of me already wanted permission to stay where I was comfortable. That realization hurt more than blaming her completely would have. I leaned back slowly in my chair and looked around my office. The same office where I once convinced myself stability was the same thing as fulfillment. I opened a blank document and typed one sentence before I could stop myself. She didn't take my future from me. She just made staying still feel noble long enough that I handed parts of it away myself. I stared at the line for a long time. Then I saved the document without naming it and closed the laptop. After a while, I called Rochelle. I explained carefully that I wanted something added to my records, not because it was necessarily legally actionable, not because I intended to build some emotional conspiracy theory around it. I simply wanted context documented accurately. The partnership discussions, the timing, the conversations afterward, the reasons I ultimately declined. Rochelle listened quietly the entire time. When I finished, she stayed silent for several seconds before speaking. "I'm sorry, Samira." I looked out the office window toward the backyard before answering. "Don't be," I said quietly. "Just make sure it's written down correctly." We ended the call there. About 50 minutes later, Rochelle called back. Her office had uncovered something during routine financial background review connected to Lynette. A business registration. Recently filed. Still active. I sat up straighter immediately. The registration itself wasn't illegal or shocking. Adults form LLCs every day for consulting work, independent contracting, tax structuring, and side businesses. What mattered was the address attached to it. Dave's office. Not our home. His office. I asked Rochelle carefully what, if anything, that actually meant legally. She explained it plainly. At that stage, not much by itself, but it potentially established deeper financial overlap between Dave and Lynette than casual personal involvement alone would suggest. Depending on future discovery, account tracing, operational activity, or commingled resources, it could eventually become relevant context. Relevant context. I appreciated that phrase more than certainty, because real investigations rarely unfold in dramatic straight lines. Most truths arrive as fragments first, connections later. After we hung up, I reopened my laptop and pulled up the 3-column document. what I know, what I can prove, what still needs clarity. Then I added the business registration beneath the third column, because for the first time since this began, I realized the most important questions were no longer emotional ones. They were structural ones, and structures leave paper behind eventually. Rochelle filed at 7:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting inside my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop 4 miles from my house when her confirmation came through. Dave had left for his morning run at 6:55 exactly. I watched him jog down the driveway from the upstairs window, waited until he disappeared around the corner, then carried the overnight bag I packed the night before, quietly out to my car. I did not leave a note. There was nothing left to explain that paperwork wasn't already prepared to say more clearly. By the time Dave returned from that run, showered, and stood in our kitchen making coffee, the filing had already been submitted to the court. The process was moving. He just didn't know it yet. I sat there in the parking lot holding coffee that had already gone lukewarm and looked out through the windshield for a long time after Rochelle's text arrived. Not because I was uncertain, because some moments deserve silence after them. 19 years had narrowed down to timestamps, signatures, financial disclosures, and a case number sitting quietly inside a county system, waiting for another business day to continue unfolding. There is something sobering about that. No orchestral music, no dramatic confrontation, just documents moving between offices while ordinary people ordered muffins 10 feet away from me without realizing somebody's marriage had just ended inside a parked sedan near the curb. He was served at 2:17 that afternoon. By then, I was already at Camille's apartment. Rochelle called with the confirmation herself, brief, professional. The documents had been delivered successfully at Dave's office by a process server. His attorney information would likely follow quickly. I thanked her and hung up. 4 minutes later, my phone rang. Dave. I watched his name light up across the screen while Camille stood at the stove pretending not to watch my face. I let it ring until voicemail. Then another call came 12 minutes later. This time not to me. Earlier in the week, Rochelle had explained something carefully during one of our meetings. Once formal proceedings begin, attorneys sometimes review activity connected to jointly held financial accounts, shared billing records, business communications, and publicly observable interactions to establish timelines and asset movement if necessary. Nothing dramatic. No illegal recordings. No movie-style surveillance vans. Just documentation, patterns, timestamps, the same kind of ordinary records businesses and courts rely on every day. Dave's second immediate call after failing to reach me went to his attorney. That made sense. His third went to Lynette. That mattered more. Not emotionally anymore. Structurally. A man learns what he values most the moment consequence arrives faster than preparation. He called legal protection first. Then he called her. Camille finished dinner quietly while I sat near the window holding my phone in both hands without unlocking it again. Pasta. Garlic bread slightly overcooked around the edges because her attention kept drifting toward me instead of the oven. We ate at her small dining table while a television show played in the background neither of us followed closely enough to remember later. Every so often I caught her studying me carefully between scenes. Waiting. Not for tears exactly, for impact. Children think heartbreak announces itself loudly because that's how movies teach them to recognize it. But by the time legal paperwork enters a marriage, most real grief has already happened privately in smaller rooms weeks earlier. Mine happened on a kitchen floor with chest pain crawling through my body while my husband laughed beside another woman across town. Everything after that was administration. Around 9:30, Camille finally asked softly, "Are you okay?" I looked at her for a moment before answering honestly. "I think I'm clear," I said. That seemed to settle something inside her more than reassurance would have. I drove home a little after 10. The house was dark except for the light above the stove. Dave always forgot to turn off when he left distracted. His car wasn't there. I hadn't expected it to be. I walked through the room slowly after locking the door behind me, not searching for evidence, not reliving memories, just looking. At the dining room table where we signed business paperwork for years, the living room where clients had once sat drinking expensive bourbon while congratulating Dave on his company, The kitchen floor where I realized survival and trust are not the same thing. I built this too. That thought no longer arrived bitterly, just accurately. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. The same chair, the same overhead light, the same stretch of tile where I had pressed one shaking hand against the floor trying to breathe steadily enough to dial a phone. The distance between that woman and this one was not dramatic. It was decisive. My phone lit up against the table a little after 11. Lynetta, not a call. A message. Long enough that I could see the paragraph breaks before opening it. I read every line carefully. She wrote herself as a woman who had been swept gradually into something complicated, feelings developing unexpectedly, timing becoming difficult, emotions becoming confusing. She spoke about guilt repeatedly without ever attaching it to a direct choice. It was polished in the way certain women polish survival. Careful wording, softened accountability, just enough sadness to invite sympathy without ever fully accepting blame. By the end of it, I realized something strangely calming. Lynette still believed this situation could be managed emotionally. She did not yet understand it had already moved beyond emotion. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Rochelle. Add this. Then I turned off the kitchen light, carried my tea upstairs, and went to bed inside the first truly honest night my marriage had seen in years. The formal valuation arrived on a Thursday morning. Rochelle called instead of emailing it. That told me enough before she even started speaking. I sat at the dining room table with coffee growing cold beside my hand while she read portions of the assessment aloud exactly as written, not dramatized, not softened, not translated into emotional language for comfort. Professional language. Precise language. The kind that survives courtrooms because it avoids performance. My contribution to Elevate Solutions was described as foundational during the company's formation and stabilization period. The report referenced the personal guarantee attached to the original financing package, the operational systems used across departments, the early client relationships connected directly to my professional network, and the credentialing profile lenders relied on when the company lacked sufficient history to secure favorable terms independently. But what mattered most to me was something else. The report did not erase Dave. That distinction settled something important inside me immediately. The assessor acknowledged his role clearly too: client acquisition, growth strategy, expansion, branding, relationship development. Dave had genuinely helped scale the company once it stabilized. He was good in rooms, good with momentum, good at making people believe growth was already happening before the numbers fully caught up. That mattered. Because the truth was not that I secretly built Elevate alone while Dave wandered around pretending. The truth was more uncomfortable than that. We built something together. Then over time, visibility slowly started replacing ownership in people's minds, including mine. Rochelle paused briefly before reading the next section. Without the combined contributions of both parties during the founding period, the company likely would not have achieved its current valuation. However, the report continued, several foundational, operational, and financial conditions critical to early viability appeared directly tied to my documented participation. I wrote that sentence down carefully, not because it made me feel victorious, because it made me feel seen accurately for the first time in years. Dave's attorney responded within the week. The response itself interested me almost as much as the valuation. It did not deny my contribution outright because the documentation was too extensive for that strategy to survive long. Instead, the argument leaned heavily toward narrative Dave's leadership, his vision, his networking ability, his role as the public-facing force driving expansion after incorporation. And honestly, parts of that were true too. I appreciated Rochelle for understanding something many attorneys don't. Exaggerated victory eventually damages credibility. So she did not respond by trying to erase Dave in return. She responded with paper, the incorporation filings, the financing package, the original onboarding framework with my author metadata attached, the Year 1 client contracts linked directly to my professional contacts, internal process structures time-stamped years before later expansion phases began. Not emotional arguments, just chronology. Paper has a way of reducing ego down to sequence. What complicated things for Dave was not that the records proved he contributed nothing. It was that his public storytelling over the years had gradually edited me almost completely out of the founding narrative. 3 separate interviews over the past decade described Elevate as something he built from the ground up. His grind, his sacrifice, his risk, his instincts. Reading those articles beside the valuation documents felt strange now, not because they were entirely false, because they were incomplete in a very deliberate direction, and incomplete stories repeated long enough eventually harden into public memory. Discovery was quietly undoing that process line by line. Around the same time, Lynette's business registration surfaced formally during financial review, not scandalously. Structurally, the LLC filing itself was ordinary enough on the surface, but Rochelle's team traced overlapping details carefully: registration timing, shared office address usage, business-related transfers that aligned with the payment patterns I had already documented months earlier. Again, nobody framed it theatrically. No one used words like mistress or secret affair inside formal filings. The language stayed professional. Potential financial entanglement involving marital resources and a third-party entity. That reframing changed everything underneath it. Affairs create sympathy debates. Financial patterns create liability questions. Word spread quietly through our professional circles after the filing became public record, not explosively. Professionals rarely gossip loudly about litigation because everyone understands they could eventually occupy the same position themselves one day. But people read. People notice edits. People connect absences. Camille sent me a screenshot one afternoon of Dave's LinkedIn profile. The wording had changed subtly. The self-made founder language was gone. A keynote appearance he'd proudly mentioned over dinner weeks earlier had disappeared from the event page entirely. His profile photo remained the same, but the confidence underneath it looked different now that I understood how much support existed outside the frame. I stared at the screenshot for a moment before setting my phone down again. I didn't feel triumphant. Truthfully, I felt something quieter than that. Relief. Because for the first time in years, reality was beginning to stand on its own, without me helping carry a false version of it. 2 days later, Rochelle called again. Dave's attorney had submitted a list of professional contacts willing to speak positively about his leadership and role in building Elevate. Character witnesses, essentially. People prepared to testify that the version Dave presented publicly matched the man they believed they knew professionally. One of the names on that list was Julian. I said nothing at first. Rochelle let the silence breathe for a second before continuing. Her office had already contacted him regarding scheduling. I asked carefully, "And?" Another brief pause. Then she said, "He agreed to cooperate." I leaned back slowly in my chair and looked out through the dining room window toward the backyard. Julian had spent months avoiding direct involvement. Now he was agreeing to sit inside formal questioning, under oath. That changed things, because men will lie casually in restaurants, offices, and phone calls every day of the week, but depositions introduce a different kind of gravity. And something told me Julian had finally started feeling it too. I was not in that room. Rochelle had been clear my presence at Camille's deposition would complicate the dynamic and give Dave's attorney something to work with. I understood the reasoning. That didn't make the morning easier. I stayed home. I made coffee I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my phone and did not look at my phone. Camille had texted at 7:42 heading in, and I had sent back 2 words: "You're ready." She was. The deposition was scheduled for 3 hours. It ran 2.5. Rochelle's assistant sent a brief update at the midpoint proceeding as expected. No disruptions. I read it and set the phone down and went to sit in the living room because the kitchen table had started to feel too small. What I knew about what happened in that room came from Camille herself, later, and from Rochelle's summary the following morning. Camille walked in as a witness, not as Dave's daughter, not as someone managing grief or performing composure. She walked in with the specific steadiness of a person who has had weeks to understand exactly what she saw and exactly what it means, and is prepared to say it clearly in front of anyone who asks. She described the lounge, the table, the sightline from where she and Kendrick were seated. She walked through the timeline, how long they were there before Dave arrived, how long she observed before she was certain, what certainty looked like when it came. She described my phone call, the exact instruction I gave her, what she did to carry it out and how, the drive to my house, what she found when she got there, the drive to the hospital. Dave's attorney tried several directions with her. Rochelle said he was professional about it, measured, not aggressive. It didn't matter. Camille had not come into that room carrying anything she wasn't prepared to set down in plain language. Every approach he tried meant the same thing: a young woman who knew what she saw and was not confused about it. Kendrick's statement had been submitted separately the week prior, clean, corroborated, consistent with Camille's account on every point that carried weight. 2 people, same table, same evening, same account independent of each other in the submission, identical in the facts. Camille called me at 4:17. Her voice was different. Lighter, the specific lightness of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just put it down in the right place. She said, "It's done, Mom." I didn't say anything immediately. I just held the phone. Then she said, "He looked at me the whole time, like he was waiting for me to stop." A pause. I didn't stop. I said, "I know, baby." We stayed on the line for another moment without talking. That was enough. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the living room and thought about my daughter walking into a place she had no business having to be because of choices that had nothing to do with her, how she absorbed it, carried it, walked into a formal proceeding and laid it down with a steadiness most grown people couldn't locate under that kind of pressure. I thought about her in that lounge, a regular evening, her own life, and what it cost her to become the person this situation needed her to be. She paid it without complaint. That night my phone rang, number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Something made me. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unfamiliar, but the name she gave was not. Desmond Carrington. He said he had heard through a mutual professional contact what I was navigating, that he had my number through that same person. He said something had always stayed with him why I hadn't taken the partnership 3 years ago. He said if I was ever open to a conversation, he was ready to have it. I stood in the middle of my living room and said, "I'll call you back." Lynette didn't disappear dramatically. That was never going to be her style. Women like Lynette rarely leave through slammed doors. They leave through delayed replies, softened excuses, and carefully increasing distance until one day you realize the relationship ended quietly several exits ago. First, it was a text Dave sent that sat unanswered overnight. Then, an entire day. Then, a canceled lunch with an explanation vague enough to sound temporary, but polished enough to avoid follow-up questions. After that came silence. Not emotional silence, strategic silence. By then, formal discovery was still ongoing, and Rochelle's office continued reviewing financial records, communication timelines connected to shared accounts, and publicly observable interactions relevant to the case. Nothing invasive, nothing theatrical, just patterns. And the pattern became obvious quickly. Lynette was pulling away. The more visible Dave's situation became professionally, the less accessible she became personally. Honestly, once I understood her more clearly, none of it surprised me. Lynette had always moved toward stability, admiration, momentum, places where somebody else had already built enough structure for her to step into comfortably. The moment that structure began shaking publicly, her instincts shifted toward preservation. Dave noticed almost immediately. Of course he did. He called her twice, from his regular number over the course of 3 days. No answer. Then, several more attempts the following week. Still nothing. Eventually, he called from another number, likely a borrowed office line or secondary business phone. Rochelle only knew this because the call later appeared inside discovery documentation connected to account records and communication disclosures both legal teams were already reviewing. Lynette answered that one, probably because she didn't recognize the number. The call lasted less than 2 minutes before she disconnected. I did not receive some secret recording or dramatic transcript like television likes to imagine these situations unfold. What Rochelle relayed later came from disclosure summaries and attorney notes tied to communications that became relevant once financial entanglements and timeline disputes entered negotiations. Even secondhand, though, the shift in Dave was obvious. Gone was the calm man who brought flowers to my hospital room, speaking in measured concern. Gone was the controlled executive voice he used in meetings and interviews. What surfaced instead sounded frantic. Not dangerous. Desperate. The kind of desperation that appears when someone realizes the person they attached their escape fantasy to has already started quietly backing toward the exit. And hearing that affected me less emotionally than I expected. Because by then, I had already started understanding something more clearly about Dave. He did not love Lynette because she transformed his life. He loved what standing beside her reflected back at him. A younger version of himself, a desired version, a version untouched by aging, responsibility, medical scares, legal filings, or the quiet exhaustion that accumulates inside long marriages people stop tending carefully. Lynette functioned the same way Elev 8 had for years. Proof, reflection, validation, and once she started withdrawing that reflection, he had nothing solid left to steady himself against emotionally. The saddest part was that I don't think Lynette ever intended to stay through consequences. Not really. She was built for proximity to comfort, not collapse. That realization stopped hurting once I accepted it fully. Dave's professional image continued shrinking quietly around the same time, not exploding, contracting. Camille occasionally sent screenshots when she noticed something significant. A revised biography here, a leadership description shortened there, an event appearance quietly removed from a public schedule. Small edits, the kind people make when they are trying to reduce the visible surface area of a story already circulating privately through professional circles. I wasn't obsessively monitoring him myself. That mattered to me. There is a point during separation where watching another person's decline too closely starts chaining you emotionally to their downfall instead of your own future. I did not want that. The following week, I ran into a woman from our professional community at a pharmacy near my cardiologist's office. I had known her casually for years, the kind of woman who always spoke to me politely at events while directing her real attention toward Dave, asking about his projects, his growth strategy, his expansion plans. Women like that are common around ambitious men. They orbit visibility naturally. She noticed me near the prescription counter and hesitated briefly before walking over. Her expression shifted into something careful. Not pity, awareness. She asked how I was doing. I told her honestly, I'm well. And surprisingly, I was. She studied me quietly for a second after I answered. Then she said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. You look it. Not performative concern. Not gossip disguised as sympathy. Recognition. The recognition that happens when somebody suddenly realizes they misunderstood where the real stability in a marriage lived all along. I thanked her and kept moving through the store. That afternoon, Rochelle called. The settlement meeting had finally been scheduled. Both attorneys, both parties. One room. I asked her carefully what position Dave's side appeared to be taking heading into negotiations. Rochelle exhaled softly before answering. His attorney, she said, was advising cooperation and reasonable settlement expectations based on the documentation already established. That translated clearly enough for me. Reality had reached the room. I asked one final question. When this settles, I said quietly, what does he realistically walk away with? Rochelle gave me the estimate plainly. Not ruin, not destruction. Just less than the version of himself he had spent years presenting publicly. I sat there silently for a moment after she finished. Then I said, schedule it. I was up before my alarm. I didn't rush. I moved through the morning deliberately, coffee first, then a shower, then the careful process of deciding what to wear to the meeting that would formally end my marriage. Not to impress anyone in that room. Not to send a message. I dress the way I dress when something matters, each piece considered, nothing accidental. By the time I picked up my keys, I looked exactly like myself. That was the point. Rochelle was already in the conference room when I arrived. She stood when I walked in, looked at me once, and gave a single nod. We had said everything we needed to say in the weeks leading to this morning. There was nothing left to prepare. Dave came in 4 minutes later with his attorney. I had not been in the same room as my husband since the morning I watched him leave for a run and walked out behind him. That was weeks ago. I had spoken to him only through Rochelle since the filing. Seeing him cross the threshold of that conference room was the first time in all of this that reality and the version I had been managing in my head occupied the same space. He looked older than I expected. Not dramatically, just the specific way a man ages when the scaffolding around him has been removed. Without the business introductions, without the house, without the wife who held the foundation steady while he performed standing on it, he was just a man in a good suit sitting down across a table. I looked at him and waited for something: anger, grief, the residue of 19 years pressing up against the surface. What came instead was clarity, the quiet, settled kind. The feeling of seeing something exactly as it is after a long time of seeing it as you needed it to be. The meeting ran its course. His attorney presented their position. Rochelle responded. There was movement, counter-movement, the careful procedural language of two sides finding the line that ends things. I followed every word. I said what Rochelle needed me to say when she needed me to say it. The rest of the time I sat still and let the process do what we had spent months building it to do. Then Dave picked up the pen. I watched his hand move across the signature line. I thought about the last time I watched him sign something in front of me, the incorporation papers, 11 years ago, my name on the guarantee beneath his, my credentials, the reason the pen was in his hand at all. He had signed that document like a man beginning something. He signed this one like a man who had run out of road. When it was done, I stood, gathered my things, and thanked Rochelle. Then I turned toward the door. I stopped. I looked at Dave once, not long, not with anything dramatic loaded into it. Just looked at him the way you look at something you have finished with. Clear, final, without residue. He held my gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked down at the table. I walked out. In the elevator, I stood alone, and the doors closed, and I saw my reflection in the brushed metal distorted slightly, the way elevator doors always are, but recognizable. I looked at myself for the full ride down. I looked like a woman standing in her own life. The lobby doors opened. My phone buzzed in my hand. Desmond Carrington, 4 words. My offer still stands. I didn't answer Desmond's message that day. I let it sit for nearly a week. Not because I was uncertain, because I needed to live inside the quiet first. Real quiet. The kind that belongs entirely to you. Mornings where no one else's mood enters the room before you do. Evenings where the television stays on the channel you actually enjoy instead of the one you've unconsciously adjusted yourself around for years. Entire Sundays where nobody requires management, reassurance, anticipation, or emotional translation from you. I had forgotten how much energy performance quietly consumes inside a marriage long before people admit it is failing. So I stayed still for a while. I relearned small things first. The temperature, I genuinely preferred my coffee instead of the version Dave liked because it was easier to make one pot. The old legal dramas I stopped watching years earlier because he complained they were too slow. The strange piece of folding laundry in complete silence without sensing tension sitting somewhere else in the house, waiting to become your responsibility eventually. Camille came by often during those weeks. Sometimes we cooked together and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Other evenings, she arrived after work, dropped her purse beside the kitchen chair, and simply sat with me quietly while one of us cut vegetables or answered emails. There is a particular kind of healing that happens when someone allows you peace without demanding emotional performance in return. Kendrick understood that instinctively. He came by occasionally too. Easy company, steady presence. The kind of man secure enough not to force himself into the center of rooms unnecessarily. He never mentioned Dave unless I brought him up first. That told me more about his character than dramatic speeches ever could have. Elevate settled gradually over the following months. Not collapsed. That distinction mattered to me. Businesses rarely explode overnight outside movies and fraud cases. What actually happens more often is contraction. Lenders become cautious, expansion slows, certain opportunities disappear quietly. Overhead becomes harder to sustain. Once guarantees shift, litigation enters public record, and operational restructuring begins touching confidence around the edges. That is what happened to Elevate. The settlement removed my financial guarantee formally. Credit structures changed afterward. A few planned growth projects stalled. Existing clients stayed, but projected expansion softened noticeably once the company had to stand entirely on the version of itself Dave alone could sustain operationally. None of that erased his contribution. Dave was still talented, still capable, still experienced. But for years, the business had been standing on more support than even he fully acknowledged publicly. Once those underlying structures separated cleanly, the company settled into a smaller, more realistic shape. That wasn't revenge. That was gravity. I called Desmond the following Tuesday. We met for lunch 3 days later at a restaurant I chose intentionally familiar enough that I wouldn't spend the conversation adjusting to the room instead of listening clearly inside it. The ease between us arrived quickly. Not romantic ease. Honest ease. The kind that happens between two adults who are no longer interested in pretending smaller versions of themselves are easier for other people to manage. The partnership offer was real, structured carefully, sustainable, not flashy startup fantasy or emotional rescue disguised as opportunity. Work. Good work. Mutual respect. A place where my experience entered the room visibly instead of silently supporting somebody else's introduction. 3 years earlier, I might have approached that table apologetically without realizing it, softening my own contribution automatically so nobody mistook confidence for arrogance. This time I didn't. I spoke clearly about what I built, what I understood, what I expected. And Desmond listened like a man hearing another professional instead of a woman requesting permission to occupy space. That mattered more than attraction ever could have. Walking back toward my car afterward, I stood for a moment beside the curb and thought about the thread connecting everything behind me. My daughter's voice tightening over the phone while I lay on that kitchen floor, the instruction I gave her while my chest hurt badly enough to blur the edges of the room, the hospital ceiling, Dave standing beside my bed performing concern, the transfer records, the valuation documents, the conference room, his hand moving across settlement paperwork, all of it connected. A thread I kept pulling carefully until eventually I reached the truth sitting underneath my own life. And the strangest part was this. The truth did not destroy me. It clarified me. I don't think about Dave very often anymore. When I do, it isn't with hatred. Hatred is exhausting. It requires continuous emotional investment in somebody who already cost you enough. What I feel now is smaller than anger and far more peaceful than forgiveness. Distance. Lynette sits differently in my mind. Some days I still mourn the friendship more than the marriage itself, not dramatically, just quietly, the way people mourn years they can never fully recover once they realize they misunderstood the foundation underneath them. That sadness surprises me less now. My health is stable, managed properly, monitored carefully. I sleep well again. I eat regularly. I work. The new business cards arrived on a Tuesday morning. I opened the box slowly and held one between my fingers for a long moment. My name at the top, my credentials underneath, my company below that, not hidden inside somebody else's story. Mine. I slipped one into my wallet, set the box carefully on my desk, and walked into the kitchen to make coffee. Camille called while it brewed. I answered on the second ring. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important at all. Grocery prices, a movie Kendrick hated, traffic near her office, whether I still overwatered the herbs near the kitchen window. Ordinary conversation. Ordinary peace. When we hung up, I stood by the window holding my coffee and watched morning settle quietly across the backyard. The day belonged entirely to me. For years, Dave introduced me as his wife while standing inside structures I helped hold upright quietly behind him. Now, when people mention my name professionally, they introduce him differently too, as my ex-husband, and only if someone asks first.